was driven primarily because we were updating the fit-out guide back in 2011. It was last published. And as we were carrying out that process, we realised that if we were to issue that, it would conflict with the main guide, so we needed to do something. And also the fact that the main guide's due for an update in the next year or two and hasn't taken into account net zero carbon, which has cropped up in the last couple of years, and the whole pandemic situation. So we've reviewed the main design criteria with a view of updating that electronically and then subsequently doing a paper copy of that. And there are three main major changes since the last update. The first of which is to do with occupational density. Last study was done in 2019, just before the pandemic, which showed that we're getting a tiny bit more dense, but not much more in office spaces. The second bit was to do with design loads and criteria in the small power loads lighting criteria, which have moved on significantly since the last time the guide was issued, and also reflect where we think the new criteria for LETI, UK GBC, REBA 2030 Challenge, all are directing us. And the final one was to do with facades, because that's a significant driver to keeping carbon down in terms of operational carbon. So those are the three major elements that we moved forward on.
I think it was also worth bringing in some of the great work the BCO have done over the last couple of years regarding ventilation and virus control in response to COVID. So they were regularly publishing updates to guidance, and that's been brought into the main guidance part of the position paper.
Yes, in a number of ways, because I think the pandemic has shown us that we can carry out hybrid working, agile working, which was mooted 20, 30 years ago by BT, who suggested the office was going to be dead anyway in a few years' time from that publication. So a lot of work's been done on hybrid working and how the new ways of working could impact on the office design, one of which is significantly looking at the occupational density and how offices will be used in the future, trying to attract people in and providing more space for collaboration, meeting rooms, hybrid meeting rooms, because a lot of people are using video conferencing, Teams and Zoom in the office space. So I think a lot of people are looking at densifying slightly some of the workspace, so where the main desks are situated, but then providing more breakout space. So on average, the office should still be similar level of density in terms of occupation. However, we need the design of the office space to take into account the ability to move air and water to spaces where it's needed. So there's slightly more densification in the office work desks, if you like, which are more agile and maybe more packed, but then the ability in other areas to have a lower occupancy. So there's quite a bit that we have to do from both the Cat A design from the developer, but also the fit out. And one of the other major issues is to do with ventilation, and demand control ventilation is going to be the norm shortly, because the new Part F of the building regulation does dictate that we have to monitor the efficiency of the ventilation system. And pretty much the only way of doing that at the moment is using carbon dioxide control. So the fit-out designers have to take this into account when they're designing how to modify the base build to suit their own installations.
I think as well as the technical requirements, there's been an acceleration of trying to incorporate ESG into the brief. So ESG has obviously risen significantly up the agenda over the last few years, and what we're trying to do with a lot of corporate occupiers is trying to get their corporate strategy incorporated into their development strategy. For years, a lot of sustainable companies have not had sustainable offices. It just hasn't flowed through, but they've realised that in order to be a net zero carbon organisational company, they really need to be thinking about their space and how they occupy it. So there's huge moves in terms of both the carbon agenda, but also social value, well-being programs, all being played out into the design of the office, which go hand in hand with these technical challenges which go forward. So huge changes, all hopefully for the positive.
this was probably the most contentious part of the conversations that we had in the Technical Affairs Committee on discussing this, and we did bring in, there were one or two other teams that were looking at similar issues, one or two of the other developers that were liaising with us at the same time. And it is a big issue because if you do provide, for the worst case, you put significant amounts of air, water, larger air handling units, risers into the space. So it was recognised that there are some users, life science for example, trading operations for financial services institutions, who will need slightly more power and water. Now, what we decided is that electrically, the amount of additional embodied carbon and operational carbon isn't significant if you do a little bit of over-provision, so you make sure you've got sufficient power supply for the building. The difficulty comes when you get to the air and cooling. So the way to look at that is to make sure that we design sensibly, but that there is a way to adapt the building, so make it flexible for the significant majority of users, but make it adaptable so you can increase the amount of air or water by adding extra in the future, allowing space for additional chillers or the like. So it's to make it adaptable for the few rather than flexible for everybody. I think that's the easiest way to look at it.
Yeah, I think it's probably been the biggest debate. So the ESG committee have been pushing this for probably over 1.5 to 2 years, since the emergence of some of the LETI and UK GBC guidance and some of the barriers of over-provision. So it's really pleasing to see where the paper is at the moment, and much of the recommendations have now been incorporated. And what we're seeing with our clients at the moment is there's this huge demand at the moment for smaller occupiers and tenants to really just come in and do minimal work. So the aim is to really get a high quality kind of Cat A, which is that flexible for most people and not over designed for the hyper tenants.
And I think there's also a little bit in terms of the three types of projects in terms of new build, major refurbishment, which might involve the facade, but significant amounts of stripping out for the Cat A and Cat B, but also minor refurbishments, and we're involved in a couple at the moment where we're trying to keep as much of the Cat A as we possibly can, major duct pipe runs, fan coil units if we think they'll last another 10 years for the next occupier. And I think occupiers, they do have advisors that come in and say, oh, it won't last 10 years, strip it out, start again. But then once they start thinking about this whole thing of circularity and embodied carbon, some of them are coming round to this. So I think we'll see more of that in the future when it comes to sort of stripping out Cat A's or Cat B's back to Cat A. We're doing one moment where we're actually leaving all this sort of power cabling, the bus bars and all the IT cabling in, and if the tenant is happy, then they can reuse it. It saves time, it saves money, it saves embodied carbon. And all the major pipe and duct runs, so absolute minimum alterations to the services.
I think over the next couple of years, it's probably going to be the biggest focus of the industry.
Yeah.
We're seeing some really forward-thinking clients really think about how much reuse and repurposing they can do. CIBSE at the same time are also doing some work into how they can repurpose and recommission MEP equipment so that it can be re-warranted and guaranteed. And that's just going to really drive embodied carbon down in the future. BCO have done some small papers on that, but expect to see a lot more, and there's some research being done there at the moment. It's moved a long way. So this paper has probably been a couple of years in the coming. So there's been some work around net zero carbon in the BCO for the last couple of years, pulling together all the good practice guidance which has come out from LETI, UK GBC, the GLA, Whole Life Carbon Network. The document at the moment is a good summary and it's moving in the right direction. It's great, we've got targets now. Those targets are fairly aspirational, aligning with LETI and UK GBC's Paris-proof targets. So I think the targets are right. The next step is really to be providing guidance, and that's what we're doing with our clients at the moment, really trying to break down those targets into budgets and then drive it forward. But one of the interesting things at the BCO conference a couple of months ago was the debate around the amount of development which is planned. And even if we hit the targets in the BCO guidance and develop at the rate we're going to be doing it, we're going to be exceeding our carbon budget. So we really need to move on to this retrofit and refurbishment programme. So yes, it's great having a net zero carbon new building, but that's still going to use significantly more than a retrofit project. And those retrofit projects will need to start really thinking about circularity going forward. So I think it's a great line in the sand. It puts a good consistency, gives guidance to the membership, but it's only the first step. There's still a long way to go.
I mean, I echo that, because when we had the conversations about this in the committee meetings and the workshops, one of the big issues was, we can't go all the way to 2050 in one go. So we've got to do it piecemeal. So there's got to be this trajectory to get there. So we're recognising the fact that buildings starting to be designed now will not be in operation for another 5 years, say, and we're only then 2-3 years off the 2030 target. So within that timescale, we're going to have to update go through this whole process again of updating the guide and the targets to try and get closer to the 2050 targets. So it's a transitional period, I think, of trying to get to the 2030, 35 targets with the buildings that we're designing now. But if we can go further, we should. They're only targets, they're aspirational. And I think that in possibly the next time we have a major guide update in 5-6 years' time, it's going to have to reflect that 2050 target.
One of the key things to remember, though, is there's a lot of buildings claiming to be net zero carbon at the moment, and they've done great work, and let's not underestimate the hard work they've gone in to get to those targets that the developers are hitting at the moment. But most of those, I think almost all of the buildings which are marketed as net zero carbon at the moment are hitting interim targets. They're not in the Paris aligned or the 2050 targets. So those buildings will have a timestamp in terms of net zero carbon. And net zero carbon in operation is exactly that. It's an operation. So those buildings will need to be retrofitted and works carried out with them to hit the intensity targets. So it's really important that with the guidance at the moment, if we are looking at interim targets and step trajectories, that we try and focus on the things which have high embodied carbon to change and are difficult to change. For example, it's much easier to change the ICT in a building than it is to reclad that building or refacade it. So we really need to be making sure that the buildings we're building today have the right fabric performance for 2050, because we don't want to be recladding those new buildings, both carbon and cost-wise.
And I think as well, the drive for lower operational carbon has meant that the amount of embodied carbon as a percentage is so much higher. So again, as Simon mentioned there, we're going to have to address that. And I think as a lot of facades, we're looking at buildings that are sort of 1990s, 2000s. The amount of embodied carbon required to replace the facades at that stage doesn't pay back in terms of operational carbon. So you've got to pick the right sweet spot as to when you can do that and how you do it. Because most of the 90s and 2000s buildings, a lot of them were full height glazing, and we've got to look at that as a major issue from a solar gain point of view.
Lots of challenges.